Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Pick it up next week. Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here at freedomslips.com, Revolution Radio, and we will be broadcasting live for the next 2 hours here on Studio B. And I thank all of you for taking the time to join us and fellowship this evening. I have a very interesting, intriguing, and exciting guest joining me for the next 2 hours. S. Douglas Woodward, and he's published 5 books, I believe, up until this point, and is busy with many projects and endeavors. And I'm really intrigued by the newest book, which we will be focused on, but I'll get him to talk about each one of them as they are all connected to what we're dealing with as world and as the Fig Tree generation. Important as far as revelation for preparing yourself and your families, your loved ones, for those things that are coming upon the world. You can find his information and the different books and trailers and things that are connected to him, his blogs and his books, all found at faithhappens.com. Douglas, are you with us, brother?
Hey, I am. It's great to be with you, Zen. Thanks for having me on.
Well, we appreciate you and taking the time to join us. And as I said, I'm really intrigued by the last book that you are. I believe you've already published it, right? And it is available.
That's right. Now, I've actually written about 9 books. This one is one that I wrote and published a year or so ago, and but it's one that continues to draw a lot of attention, and based upon our discussions and understanding of your audience, it seemed like it might be one of the ones that would be the most interesting to folks, and so I think it's where we should begin, definitely.
Oh, absolutely. And before we go into that, if you would provide just your contact information if people were to want to, a Facebook or email address, anything of that nature. Yeah, I know your website and all, but and then also please speak about each one of your 9 books as far as what, just general discussion, what they are about.
Sure. No, I appreciate the opportunity to do that. All right. Basic contact information. My website is Faith Happens, FAITH-happens, faithhappens.com. And my my Facebook site is S as in Stephen, S Douglas Woodward. And you can also reach me through an email, which is Faith. You can just use Doug at faith-happens.com. That is a good way to get a hold of me. And I'm pretty good about responding to emails, so I'd encourage your listeners to feel free to ask me questions, and I'll do my best to get back to them here pretty quick. And so those are the different ways. You can also just search for me. You can do a search on DougWoodward.com. It'll take you to my website if all else fails and you can't remember Faith Happens, then DougWoodward.com will get you there. And you can find my books at Amazon, S. Douglas Woodward. There's an S. Douglas Woodward store. Any of the books that I've written that folks are interested in, if they'd like me to sign those books, that is a way to do that through Amazon. All my books are on Kindle and on iBooks, on Lulu, and on Nook. And so there's electronic copies of all of them as well.
Excellent. Well, I know that you were involved and had been part of Microsoft and were involved with technology and things of that nature. But have you always had an interest in the prophetic word and study of mythology? How is it that you came to be an author? Kind of.
Right. Well, I'm a young man of 60 years old, and I've been I would say in the fold, accepted Christ in my life probably when I was about 10 years old. I'm one of those guys that listened to Billy Graham on television, and as a child, that made sense to me to invite Christ in my life, and so I became a Christian a long time ago. When I was 15, I had a really nasty bout of cancer. I had a disease called rhabdomyosarcoma. Rhabdo, as it's sometimes shortened, and it is a type of cancer that strikes adolescents. Again, I was 15 when this occurred. Ultimately, lost my left leg to the disease, but after lots of radiation therapy, some chemotherapy, and so forth, managed to pull through. It also helped that I had people praying for me all over the country, and struck up relationships with lots of different people. And but somehow, I think because the Lord had a plan for me that extended beyond just having cancer, that I managed to get through that. So I definitely believe that that the Lord's hand was on me, and so that was back in the year 1969, and so really I got into. I thought I was going to go into the ministry, but things just didn't kind of work out that way. I got into computers, and after a number of years, I eventually worked for Oracle. I worked for Microsoft. It was general managers for both Oracle and Microsoft. I was a partner at the large accounting firm of Ernst & Young. So I've been in business most of my career. About 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I started writing books. I'd studied Bible prophecy. I started to say I was another one of those guys that was captivated by, in about 1970, when Hal Lindsey released the book Late Great Planet Earth. That had a big influence on my life. It kind of suggested to me that history was going somewhere, and so I got very interested in prophecy and the prophetic word at that time. So I've read, not just dozens, but probably 100 books on prophetic subjects through the years, as well as just studying the scripture and participating as was an elder and was an associate pastor at a Methodist church for a little while before I really got into computers, and was an elder in the Presbyterian church, the Reformed church, and but the bulk of my career really was in computers, software, internet, media, things like that. So, but it's been in the last 5 or 6 years that I've written 9 books. And I've spoken at a number of conferences. I have appeared on television. There's quite a few. If you go out and look at YouTube, and folks look under S. Douglas Woodward, they're going to see a lot of YouTubes. I've spoken on at different conferences. The television show Prophecy in the News, been on there quite a few times, and talked a lot about my book. So there's videos out there as well that people might like to look at if they kind of are interested in the things that I've got to talk about. So that is another way people can get acquainted with me. I live in Oklahoma. I will be married next month for 40 years.
Wow.
And I'm real pleased. Thank you. Pleased about that. I have a daughter that's following in her father's footsteps. She's about 36 years old, almost, and is at Microsoft and works there in Seattle. In fact, she's coming to visit me and has just gotten in town here just a little while ago. So after we get done talking together, I'm going to go see my daughter. She's staying over at my son's house. And so my second child is a son that's 31 years old. And I finally have a grandson. His name's Brody, and he is a delight. And so I've kind of graduated from having just grand dogs to actually having a grandchild. And so I'm pretty excited about that.
Oh, big step up there.
Yeah, a big step up. Not even close. So so that's a little bit about myself. My wife Donna is a nurse, and again, we've been married for almost 40 years. So I've been very privileged. I've worked for some great companies and developed a lot of great relationships, and very plugged into the sort of the prophetic community of the writer, researchers, and speakers, and I'm really privileged to interact with a lot of folks, and so that's kind of my story.
Well, it sounds like quite an intriguing life. Um, I don't know if you know anything as far as my particular story too, but I acquired a disability when I was 24 years old, and I've been in a wheelchair since. And that ever since that time, I've had a lot of space and time to put forth and place my focus on study of the word and mythology, ancient mysteries, and to have really digested and to have been diligent in my research. And whereas most people are so busy, so consumed as far as just trying to manage their daily lives and pay, make the money to pay their bills and to keep food on the table. And so a lot, and of course that has been done in such a way to keep most people occupied so that they can't place their focus and their priority on the kingdom, and
Right.
that the matrix has been instilled in such a way to keep the majority of the masses their focus off of God and Creator and creation and those things which are truly relevant for our eternal inheritance and our salvation of soul and things of that nature. And so
Right. No, exactly. Well, you and I have a bit in common there. I'm a bit more mobile than you, but we both are going to really rejoice in the kingdom, as it says, the lame shall leap, and you and I'll go leap together somewhere.
Yeah, brother, it sounds good. Sounds good.
So so I could talk briefly about the books I've written, if you'd like.
Yes,
And
please do.
yeah, I started off writing a book, Are We Living in the Last Days, which was a really kind of an introductory book, fairly lengthy, but I covered sort of all of the different points of view on different topics related to Bible prophecy, and so that's kind of how I got started. It was a good way for me to get kind of grounded. Second book I wrote was pretty popular. It was called Decoding Doomsday, and really was it sort of sounds funny to say, but it was sort of a history of doomsday, and sort of a history of the different theories about doomsday and the different times in the past where people had come to the conclusion that we had arrived at the end of the world. And so I talk quite a bit about that. I talk about the prophecies, from prophets like Nostradamus to the prophets of the Bible, and talk about what I believe is coming upon the earth. And so that was the second book. Let's see, a third book I wrote called Black Sun, Blood Moon, which was more of a personal testimony about the meaning of prophecy to me. Then let's see, the fourth book, Power Quest Book 1 and Power Quest Book 2. These are a little bit more academic studies. Together they're about 800 pages in length.
Wow.
And they really focus on the really a historical understanding of the paranormal in America and how it's influenced our spiritual sort of our spiritual culture in America, and then it moves into book 2 moves into an analysis of sort of all of the different factors that have influenced our politics and where I think we're going. So a lot of emphasis upon the Nazis, on mind control, which you were alluding to earlier, on eugenics. I listened briefly to a program that you did with Dan Duvall. And was it Carolyn
Hamlet? Yeah.
Hamlet, yeah. Dissociative identity disorder, the CIA. Those are all topics I talk about. The Kennedy assassination. I talk about all those in Power Quest Book 2. It's not. I would say that it's quite readable, but it's lengthy, and the subjects are dark. But people that are interested in getting a really good grasp of sort of all these different influences on America, that is a book that they might enjoy reading. I took it up a notch and co-wrote a book called The Final Babylon with co-authors Doug Krieger and Dean McGriff. And the final Babylon is arguing that while there have been many Babylons in the Bible, many Babylons in history, that we happen to believe that we are living in the last of the last days, and that the final Babylon is not Europe. It's not a revived Roman Empire. It's not in Islam. Although Islam it certainly embodies, in our point of view, the spirit of the Antichrist. But no, the final Babylon we actually believe is the United States. More broadly, perhaps Western Anglo-Americanism, but specifically the sort of the economic, military, political, and cultural center of the world is the United States. And so that book, The Final Babylon, has sold quite well and continues to sell well, and it is a discussion that many people are finding very interesting, because the sort of the first line in the book, and this is in response to the traditional scenario of Hal Lindsey and Grant Jeffrey and Tim LaHaye and so forth, is that Rome has not revived. And so we are challenging the idea that Europe is, in fact, the power structure of the Antichrist. We believe the power base of the Antichrist is really in the military and the economics of the United States, and that the Antichrist could, in fact, be an American leader. And I won't speculate too much, at least not on the air, regarding who that leader might be. Nevertheless, that book has been quite a good one, and has been very influential. So it's still raising a lot of debate about because it does take a different point of view than the traditional scenario of late great planet Earth and really traditional prophetic teaching. So and then after that book, I wrote the book that we're going to talk about tonight, the book on Mars. And that one is really my response to the whole issue of ancient aliens, and so we'll get into that and talk about why that is, why the issue of Mars and in our culture has been such an important run up to the whole ancient alien phenomenon that has been such a big thing in especially in the last, I'd say, 3 years, 4 years. Certainly even longer in our culture, going all the way back to Chariots of the Gods with Eric Van Daniken and all of that as well. But we'll really get into that tonight, talk about that. I've written a book called Blood Moon, which is an analysis of the whole blood moon phenomenon. I take more of a moderate point of view than the Pastor Mark Biltz and John Hagee. They are arguing that we're really upon the cusp, perhaps as early as September of 2015, for the 70th week of Daniel. Let me sip my coffee. And and so they're arguing that that we may be right upon the final weeks or months here before the tribulation, the so-called Great Tribulation, all that begins. I apologize. Hopefully that'll go away here in a minute. And go ahead.
No problem. Take your time. Well, it seems that there's a lot of disparate work from different people that are all pointing towards this particular time, as like the Dewey Brewer's, the Daniel's Timeline, Stuart Bess and his work on the Omega Code, and there's a lot of different things, even with the Revelation 12, the virgin clothed in the sun with the moon beneath her feet, a crown of 12 stars, a child within her womb, and how that plays out to, if you can look up that celestial alignment with the Solarium or Starry Night, one of those programs.
Right.
Yeah, and it connects to the Feast of Trumpets 2017. And so, and then, of course, the tetrad moons have to, in the way that they have all fallen on the Hebraic feast days, and that is significant. The regathering, recreation of Israel as a nation, as the blooming of the fig tree, and how Christ says in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21 that this will be the generation that that all things would be fulfilled. That we would see the return, the second coming, and so.
Well, I agree. I think that the caution I've got is that drawing a bead on this September, that may be a little bit too specific, but my sense is that we are within perhaps a decade of the return of the Lord. And so then it becomes kind of a question of whether you believe in a post-tribulation, a pre-wrath, a pre-tribulation point of view. And don't know, would you say your listeners tend to have one particular point of view as it relates to that?
I think that a lot, especially those that have done a lot of research, is pre-wrath, which myself, I know that in John, it speaks of the last day, and I equate that as also lining up with the last trump. And so, but there's a lot of people that take different positions. I personally don't believe that there are multiple multiple raptures, and but according to what Christ says, Jesus Christ, Yeshua says in John, I can't remember if it's John chapter 6 or what, but there's several references that it says the last day, and so what's your position on that?
Yeah, well, it has really been a controversial position, and Zen, I find that when I state my position, it usually alienates about everybody because because the pre-trib people say, well, you're not articulating it quite the way that we pre-trib people would, and then the pre-wrath people say, well, you sound kind of pre-trib to me, and so what I tend to say is that I am a pre-tribulational view believer, but I have to specify a number of things. I think there's a number of scriptural requirements that talk in terms of the restrainer. Who is the restrainer? There's an argument that the standard argument is that the restrainer of Thessalonians is in fact the Holy Spirit, that until the Holy Spirit ceases to restrain, the spirit of the Antichrist will not be incarnated in a specific man of lawlessness. So I still believe that restrainer is most likely the spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ. Uh-huh. The concept of imminency, I talk in terms of imminency as the absolute freedom of God to come, the freedom of Jesus Christ to come back at any time to gather His church.
Right.
I believe that He taught us to watch. At all times, to watch. What I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. And so I believe that we are to be ready every day for the possibility.
Yes.
And so I argue that. I believe that there is a restriction. I believe there is a specific period of time that really is the wrath of God as it's described in the certainly in the trumpets and the vials. I really believe it begins with the sixth seal as opposed to the first seal of Revelation. And so that tends to suggest that the wrath of God is poured out sometime in the so-called Great Tribulation, as Jesus describes it in Matthew 24. There are those that would argue that the abomination of desolation and all of the tribulation of Matthew 24 relates, of course, to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 67 to 70 A.D. during those wars. I believe that was fulfilled in part in that period of time, but I believe there is a future fulfillment as well.
I agree.
And yeah, and so I argue that both pre-trib and pre-wrath believers are really pre-wrath in the sense that there is a wrath of God that is coming, and that believers will not go through that period of time. Post-tribs believe that we will be, those of us that are believers will endure unto the end, and we will be here during the wrath of God, but we will somehow be protected. And I think that's a possibility, but that's not what I believe. So the rapture is very controversial. And I tend to argue that we are under a mandate to watch at all times, and so that's really the key thing. And there's some logical arguments that suggest that perhaps we shouldn't be watching for the Antichrist as much as we should be watching for Christ. And if the Antichrist has to come before Christ comes for his church, then that would tend to suggest that it's not possible for there to be a pre-tribulation rapture. But my view is that we are to watch for Christ, and so I see that as the blessed hope of the church. And trying to systematize that, it gets into some fairly detailed arguments. But I believe in the imminency, and I believe in again, I think one of the primary ingredients or factors that influence and really are part of the pre-tribulation point of view. So, and of course, with that, I'll make some enemies out there. So.
Yeah, well, you can't please everybody, and you have to go with where you feel. But I'm like you. I feel that we should be perpetually ready, and that we should have our house in order, and like the wise virgins, have our wicks trimmed and our oil ready, and to be awaiting the bridegroom. So
that's right.
Yeah. So, but all right. I have a question from the chat room as to, have you read or have you studied about the Nag Hammadi codices? And also, I'll elaborate on that. Have you also, and do you include in your studies like the pseudepigrapha, the apocrypha, the extra biblical, extra canonical texts, books of Enoch, that kind of thing?
Right. Well, the Nag Hammadi texts, obviously the things that really deal with Gnosticism, what was discovered, I believe, in 1947 by Muhammad Ali, not the Muhammad Ali we think of in America, but a tribesman in Egypt known as Muhammad Ali. I'm familiar with it. I certainly have read the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary. There's really a slew of books that were included, of course, in that, and so I'm very familiar with it. The whole issue of the Orthodox Christian point of view versus the Gnostic point of view, I'm pretty hardcore about the Orthodox point of view. I've read a lot of Bart Ehrman's books, Elaine Pagel's. I've read some of her material as well, and tend to be very much opposed to their perspective.
All right, hold on, Douglas. We'll be right back.
Hey.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Doug, I have a question from Doc Who in the chat room. He wanted to ask you what your view was on Prince William and his connections to being possible Antichrist, or if you knew anything about that.
Right. Well, there's my friend Jim Fletcher had written a book. I can't quite remember the exact title, but it was something like, having tea with the Antichrist or something like that, where he argues that the heraldry of the King of England is in fact a sort of a testimony to the king being the Antichrist. And Prince William, I find it interesting that he was born on the summer solstice, and he will be 33 years old here in a year or two, and I'm gonna have to get up and get a mint or something in a minute. But
Sure.
But anyway, I'm fascinated by the possibility that that he is certainly one of the potential candidates. Others say, well, no, maybe Prince Charles is not going to relinquish the throne, and so. But it's a possibility, and William is a very appealing, very attractive personality, a handsome guy, and so forth. And so I'd say those that are keeping an eye out for possible candidates for the Antichrist, he could be one. No reflection on his character that I know of, but nevertheless, there's some reasons to suspect that.
Yeah, my friend Dr. Joy, she's written a book on and has included in her work a lot of speculation along that line as well. But let's go ahead and get into your latest book. If you would set the premise for us, and then tell us how it is that you got interested and involved in writing about it, and then tell us about Mars and its connections with the ancient aliens.
All right. Well, of course, there's a lot there. I guess first
Yes.
off, the the interest I developed for it began with the awareness of just sort of the crazy interest in ancient aliens. And as I began to study that and contemplate that, I'd always been interested in the planet Mars. And really, the planet Mars is the only planet that we anticipate that we could actually land on, potentially colonize, and so it's consequently it has preoccupied our space program really since the 1960s, and then there's been kind of no end of speculation on Sidonia of Mars, the face on Mars, and so there's been a lot of people that have wondered whether or not there's an ancient history. By ancient, I mean something that could have been 1,000,000 years ago, that perhaps there was some form of life on the planet Mars. And then there are those like Richard Hoagland, who had popularized the concept of Mars as where the human race began. And with the latest pictures from the Mars rover, and there had been a lot of speculation about whether or not we were seeing pictures of artifacts on the planet Mars. And so I began to dig in because I was just really intrigued by this. I came across one particular book that was written by Clive Prince and, let's see, that's right, or is it? Yeah, Clive Prince and Lynn Picknett, and and talking about Mars. I'll grab the title here in a second because it's not too far away from me. But their book on Mars, they had written a book on Mars just before the year 2000, the Y2K phenomenon, and they had seen that as a kind of a red letter date, a kind of a crescendo to a number of things that have been going on at that time, with the speculation that ancient civilizations, that there was some connection between the pyramids at Giza and the pyramids on Mars. There were a number of others. Graham Hancock had written a book called The Monuments of Mars, and once again he speculated on the same things. And there sort of was a coalescence of a number of authors that had written on this topic, and it really got me intrigued. And so as I dug into it, what I discovered was that there was a pretty good reason to believe that our culture's interest in the planet Mars, which goes back, at least in modern times, it goes back to about 1875, that this was really a kind of a process of indoctrination to begin to get the culture ready for the notion of ancient aliens, what I call the gospel of ET or extraterrestrials, which, as ancient alien theory talks about on the History Channel, that the view is that the gods of the ancient religious books, these gods were in fact extraterrestrials, and that they had visited Earth in times past, and that they had been nurturing the human race. And so I really decided it was important to study specifically the concept of Mars. And as I dug into Richard Hoagland and became more familiar with his argument that before we were Earthlings, we were Martians, and given Hoagland's background and the following that he has had, I thought, well, that's really where I need to begin. I need to begin to study that, his point of view, and of course he had written one of the primary books. Let me jump to that here. See if I can find it, and that's where my study kind of began. And I had come across other books, come across Nick Redfern, Oh, by the way, the name of the book with Picknett and Prince is called The Stargate Conspiracy. The truths about extraterrestrial life and the mysteries of ancient Egypt. And so they were, again, exploring this, is there really a connection between Egypt and Mars, specifically the pyramids of Egypt, the pyramids of Mars. Hoagland and I began to read a book called Dark Mission by Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra, and in this they argue that there has been a contest, a battle between the Freemasons and Nazis that had come to America through Operation Paperclip, and that these two factions had come to a conflict inside of NASA. And as most of your listeners will recognize, a guy named Werner von Braun had been a Nazi, had been in the SS. He was responsible for the German rocket program, not by himself, but he was really kind of the focal point, the iconic figure of that. And over about a 10-year period, he worked himself up into the position where he was the head of NASA. And by the time that we were landing on the moon, Hoagland was the head of NASA. And so we had here at one time a very definite Nazi that had been brought across from Germany to the United States, along with his entire rocket team from Peenemünde, which was the German manufacturing and research plant near the Baltic Sea in North Germany. This entire group had come to the United States. There were other rocket scientists that were more or less captured by the Russians, and obviously went back to the Soviet Union. But you really had, in effect, the space race was between Nazi rocket scientists that were in the United States and Nazi rocket scientists that were in the Soviet Union. And so the sort of backdrop to this whole theme was, what in the world are so many Nazis doing in the United States, and how did they get here, and what's their ultimate purpose? Well, anyway, Hoagland and Barra in Dark Mission argue that there were two competing factions, the Freemasons and the Nazis, and that they were vying for control of the space program because they really had a hidden agenda in regards to what they were trying to accomplish on the moon landings and ultimately what they wanted to accomplish in space exploration. And to make a long story short, what they were trying to accomplish was to prove the hypothesis that extraterrestrials had come into our solar system perhaps 1 million years ago, that they had, sort of like the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, they had left artifacts of some significance on our moon and on Mars, and so there has been really since Hoagland first began to popularize this with his books. It's become just a very, very significant part of our culture, and a lot of people would call it pseudoscience, and I suppose that's not that's not unfair to say that, but it's been a dominant theme. And so what I've done, apologize, my dogs have decided to bark here in the background.
No problem.
So hopefully you can hear me better than my dog. But what I do in a lot of chapters here in the book, how many chapters do I have? Let's see, probably about 15, 16, 17. I go through and look at all kinds of issues associated with Mars, the occult, and the connections between the occult and the planet Mars, and then really establish that it's again, as I said kind of at the outset, it's the fact that our culture had really gotten just so intrigued with Mars, and by the year 1901, it was common belief that there was extraterrestrial life, there was life on Mars, and not only that, but it was intelligent life, and they were even human. And so it really becomes just a fascinating story of how intrigued we've become, and then, as I said, it really begins to it shows off the fact that there was a very tight connection between Mars and our speculations about Mars, about science fiction, and then the occult. And so all of these things are really tied together. There was a particular science fiction writer, H.P. Lovecraft, who had written in the 1920s, really didn't become popular until the late 1930s, 1940s, sort of posthumously after his death. But a lot of Lovecraft's stories, the cult of Cthulhu, the mountains of Mars, things like that, are stories that really tie into the ancient alien themes, and so it really gets right in the heart of some of the mythologies associated with Madame Blavatsky, Theosophy, and a number of other things. So it really is it's kind of the jumping off point for so many of these issues, and we can kind of dig in and talk about a lot of these if you'd like.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I do, and I want to actually mention two things to you. Have you heard Rush Limbaugh and that whole rant that he had on the Gore report?
No, I haven't. What did he tell us?
Oh, it's fascinating. I'll read a little bit to you and then get you to comment on it. Let me pull it up. Well, anyways, he talks about, it's a 7-minute segment on one of his radio programs where he's talking about NASA and about how they had discovered life, and him being a high level media person, that he has access. He's seen a highly classified report called this Gore report, and he talks about life on Mars. And I'll just read an excerpt for you and then get your comment. He says, there was life on Mars. That's what NASA is not being up front. There was life. Everybody knows it. We can't be the only people occupying the universe. It's impossible. Who do we think we are? The only people God created? Sorry for those of you who don't believe in God, only people who evolved from apes. So it's clear that there was life elsewhere, and now that NASA has kind of let the cat out of the bag, if there were habitable conditions up there, we know there was life there. In fact, they found some DNA evidence up there that compares favorably to members of the Skull and Bone Society here on Earth. These people were highly industrialized, the Martians. They were technologically superior, and they were very arrogant people, and they thought that the power and the force of their existence was all that was needed to sustain them. And they didn't care a whit about the conservation. They didn't care a whit about preserving anything. They got rid of everything that was pristine. I'm going to skip just a little bit further down. They had rainforests. You don't hear about this. They had ancient rainforests. They had jungles. They had so much oil and gas. They had reserves out the wazoo. In fact, one of the things they found on Mars is that it's possible that there's still some there. Tiny little amounts, but it's clear. You saw the pictures from Mars. I saw the skeletons. At least I saw the fossils of the skeletons. There were people there, or there were beings there, but it looked like Pompeii. It looked like these people all died huddled together, and it was just swarmed, and in an instant. There was one day they were here, and then they were gone. I'll skip just a little bit more, and then I'll get you to comment on this.
Okay.
But the elites got off. The elites were able to travel in space. They weren't very many of them, but they were able to get off. They fled the planet in time. The stunning thing about the Mars report, the Gore report, is that they're here. These people that destroyed Mars are here. They are on Earth, folks. They are in America. They work at Halliburton. They work at Enron. They work at WorldCom. They're at Boeing. They came to America, and the Gore report clearly illustrates they have not learned a thing from their experience on Mars.
Well, I can't decide whether he's attempting to be serious, or
Right.
whether he's somehow using the whole issue of Mars as a means to talk about his view of the sort of ridiculous nature of ecology, the green movement, climate change, etc. So it's a little bit hard to know whether he's speaking tongue in cheek or whether he's speaking and trying to be serious.
Right.
And the reason is, of course, there are some folks that would basically say almost exactly the same thing that he was said, but they'd be perhaps a little bit less sarcastic sounding, a bit more serious. And now the reality is that I've looked a lot at the photographic evidence, and the photographic evidence to me there is limited number of photos that really raise some questions about whether there might have been an ancient civilization on Mars. We'd almost have to go and examine sort of those photos one by one, and talk about some of the really phenomenal elements that are in the Sidonia plain.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about
Yeah,
this too, real quick before I forget.
sure.
Have you seen how the area around Glastonbury, England,
Yes.
the street layout, it's exactly like the Sidonia layout. And so whoever had built the Tholus and the DNM and all that on Sidonia on Mars seems to have been the people that had constructed the Glastonbury area here in England.
Yeah, that is in fact one of the things I was referring to, is that the issue of Silbury Hill, the Tholus, the road structure, and so forth. I do talk about that. There are some just absolutely remarkable geographical uh, comparisons. I need to find some of these references so I can share some links with people. So I'll kind of go dig into that while we're talking. But yeah, I am familiar with that. It's an area that David Flynn, the late David Flynn,
Right.
you're probably familiar with David Flynn. I don't know
Hmm.
if a lot of your listeners are, but he passed away a few years ago. But he had written a book on Sidonia, and it was his considered opinion, which I talk about in the book, that there was a connection in ancient human history from, let's say, perhaps anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. He has perhaps a different timeline than most, we'll say, conservative evangelicals would have regarding the flood of Noah. So he tends to believe the flood of Noah may have been closer to 10,000 BC versus roughly 2,500 BC, which is where sort of the sort of traditional particular view is about, or specific view about the timing of the flood of Noah. But anyway, David Flynn gets into the discussion of the Greek mystery religions, and in those mystery religions, he points out the comparisons between Sidonia, the Sidonius fruit, the quince, the five-part fruit, which of course sort of is suggestive of a pentagram, and that it was the quince, which is more of a golden pear-like shaped fruit, that was very likely to be the fruit of the of Adam and Eve fame. It was the quince that was the tempting fruit that the talking snake talked to Eve about in the Garden of Eden. And so Flynn does some really phenomenal work in that regard that I find very, very intriguing. So I apologize, I'm not able to jump and find some of these links as quickly as I'd like to.
You'll be
Yeah.
fine because we've got a break in about 3 minutes and
Oh,
it'll
good.
or
Okay.
5 minutes, so you'll have plenty of time.
I'll have some time then to kind of grab a
Yeah.
couple of these and point out where people can go look as we're talking, and look out on the internet. So now that would be great.
Right, and there's another thing as far as the revelation that Arizona Wilder she brings out and talks about, which is similar to what Rush talked about in that rant, and whether he's spoofing or not, there's some connections to what he says and what the speculation is. All right, we'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody, for second hour. I'm your host, Zen Garcia, and I have as guest with me S. Douglas Woodward. His website is faithhappens.com, and he's the author of 9 books. We're talking about his latest book, The Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. And very intriguing topic. I know that the listening audience has a great interest in this area of esoteric and knowledge and connection with the fallen angels, the strong delusion, and all things that are lined up that are connected to this. And I definitely think that book that David Flynn wrote on Sidonia, it's a hard one to find, but I do believe they reprinted it, and so it's made it more accessible. But it's a fascinating read, and I do recommend it to anybody that has any kind of an interest in this particular topic. I do want to remind the listening audience just really quick that Revolution Radio is the largest listener-supported, commercial-free, and corporate-free entity on the internet and on the planet, and that we do need your monetary support in order to continue being a platform for truth, to be able to talk unbiased on all the things that we speak on in connections to the Matrix, current events, the New World Order, the conspiratorial side of things, which, I appreciate your work, Douglas, because you also are aware of the conspiratorial side of, like government-sponsored terror, the controlled opposition, the way that the powers, the principalities, the rulers of darkness use that controlled opposition in order to drive an agenda, specifically, the New World Order, and that even though most think it's about global rule and world government, it's mostly about exalting themselves and becoming as gods themselves and stealing the worship. The whole strong delusion of getting the whole world to believe that they are our creators.
Yeah, absolutely. I have studied that. The book I wrote, Power Quest Book 2, really is focused on the nature of the elite and their influence upon America, and so many of the different areas that we've seen that sort of come to pass. Specifically, eugenics. I do a pretty extensive study on eugenics and kind of how it bridges into transhumanism today, and have done a number of talks on that. Folks that go to my website will see some articles on those subjects, and you're welcome to look at my PowerPoints. They're under a password protection. I'm happy to share it. It's just the password is just the word Jerusalem, the city Jerusalem, all lowercase. And so you'll see presentations on these subjects and quite a bit of information that's just available out there, a few articles, sections from Power Quest Book 2. And so, yeah, I definitely have written extensively on these things. I don't believe in every conspiracy theory, but I do happen to believe that America is the primary catalyst to drive forward the concept of the New World Order, which is very definitely a Western program of the elite in England, the United States, to a lesser extent Western Europe and Japan. But it is sort of a dominant aspect of what is sort of driving the political, military, economic program that is really the dominant aspect of what's happening in the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing to really recognize is that even though the politics and all the dog and pony show of it is what the world is focused on, this is a spiritual war. This is a battle of good and evil, light and darkness, and those forces are even though so many deny that there's a Satan or a Lucifer, a fallen cherub, a rebel angel, and many also deny Christ. Say that he's an ascended master or even God. There's so many now that are embracing these various pagan religions and the whole pantheon. They are now worshiping a pantheon of olden gods. The whole Druidism and uh,
Hmm.
the the whole nationalist uh, digging back into our past and all these ancient pagan religions. The world is ripe for what the Bible terms as the strong delusion. And so, if you would, can you talk about that in connection to your research and present some things that you think that we should know that are some of the intriguing aspects of what
Hmm.
you've looked into?
Well, certainly. One thing I'll point out that in the chat room, I've listed a number of the links that we were talking about earlier. Watcher's Vault, David Flynn talked about. There's a specific link that goes into in detail about the Silbury Hill, Avebury Circle, and the connections, the 19.47 degree connection parallel between the structures on Mars and the structures in England, which is really right in the heart of where the crop circles are and so forth. So there's a pretty extensive article there, probably equivalent of about 4 pages, a lot of photographs, and this was done by David Percy back in 1995, so it's been around for quite some time. But it's a pretty fascinating study, so I wanted to point that out, and that those links are in the chat room, so folks that want to do a little bit more research on their own, the links have been provided. Let's see. In terms of the discussion about kind of the global conspiracy, certainly the notion of new world order. That itself is a phrase that's been around and been used by a number of people. Adolf Hitler talked about a new world order. So did Franklin Roosevelt. We know that his vice president, Henry Wallace, got the idea of putting the notion of new world order on the back of the dollar bill, Nova Ordo Seclorum, and a number of other sort of Latin phrases, really part of the symbolism that was put on the back of the $1 bill, the Great Seal of the United States, etc. So these are not new things. These are things that have been pointed out by Chris Pinto, a filmmaker, and Tom Horn in his book, Apollyon Rising 2012. So certainly believe that book is very, very important. I think that in terms of understanding the agenda for America, there's really a lot of sources, and they're not necessarily just Christian sources. There have been quite a number of scholars, geopolitical consultants, academics that have talked about what is it that America's really up to. I just came across a new book today. Let's see if I can find the title for it here in a second, but I think it's called World Power or something like that. But it's really looking at what is it that America's trying to accomplish in the world. But there have been, no shortage. David Rockefeller, certainly the Rockefellers, their influence in the United Nations, the original League of Nations, the notion of trying to create a single world government in order to reduce the probability of warfare. Of course, those of us that look at it from a biblical worldview, we see it as truly a conspiracy. H.G. Wells called it an open conspiracy, but it is a conspiracy in effect of the elites, those that believe that they are smarter than the rest of us, attempting to control what happens in the world, and from their standpoint, to keep the masses under the thumb of the intellectuals, the elites, and the wealthy and the powerful. And it's their view that they would create a better world. But as you point to, Zen, there are certainly no shortage of individuals that are within that, perhaps a subset sometimes known as the Illuminati, that are sort of the creme de la creme, a subcommittee, if you will, that appear to have had a plan. Manly P. Hall, who was the primary historian for Freemasonry, talked about the secret destiny of America, and it's been a kind of a published plan, the great work, as the Freemasons called it, to see in America the catalyst to bring about a world in which reason instead of dogma, in which a representative democracy, at least that's what they would say, as opposed to a priesthood, a repudiation of the traditional structures in Europe. That really was what the American experiment was meant to be, that it was no longer to be run, a nation run by the priesthood or by the monarchy, but it would be run by intellectuals, by individuals that were motivated by the principles of republicanism. And by that, I don't mean the Republican Party. I mean Jeffersonian republicanism. And that would be the best form of government. And so those really were the founding principles upon which the nation was built. Not so much a Christian nation, but a nation freed from the tyranny of a sort of ruling class, whether that ruling class was the monarchy or it was the priesthood and the Catholic Church. But that really was the impetus for the American Revolution. Now you kind of come fast forward a couple of hundred years, and you ask, what is the role of America today? And, America is, without question, the world's leading military power. It has, at any given time, either slightly below or slightly above 1,000 military bases around the world. America has become, in the 21st century, and really at the second half of the 20th century, was the ruling empire the same way the British had been throughout the 19th century. And the sort of like there used to be a rule that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, in the world today, the sun never sets on the American Empire. The United States is the dominant military power. There's never been a military power as strong as the United States. That does not mean that it's well structured to deal with counterinsurgencies. It's not necessarily well structured to deal with Al Qaeda. And it's reluctant to get involved in wars such as with ISIS, as we've seen. America has, though, been the police of globalism. It really has been with Woodrow Wilson, with FDR, and really with every American president in this century. Only Ronald Reagan was probably reticent to get too involved in a sort of being the catalyst, the police, the enforcer of the New World Order. It's been virtually every American president that has been attempting to try to make the New World Order come to pass. Now, just in the last very few years, we've seen some pushback from Russia and from China, who aren't so sure they want to go along with the notion of a New World Order. And Henry Kissinger just recently published a book called World Order, in which he talks about the sort of the ideal. He goes back all the way to, I think it's like 1648, talks about the Treaty of Westphalia. And it was a treaty that was to end essentially a century of war in Europe, but it was based upon the concept of a negotiated settlement that allowed, or it said that all governments should be able to establish a government that reflects the aspirations of their people, and that other governments surrounding them should not interfere in those nation states. And and so Kissinger sort of wraps this blanket of idealism around himself and says that that's really what America and the West has been trying to do. Is it's been trying to create this type of world order. But of course, those in the third world would say, well, but America really has been trying through the CIA and through economics and through the World Bank and through the International Monetary Fund. It's been attempting to exert its will upon all of the world, and that at the heart of the power structures of the world, you really have the economic power of Wall Street and the city of London, which is the financial district in London, and that essentially the world has been managed or attempt to be run and controlled by Anglo-Americanism for about 300 years. And so that's sort of the historical backdrop that I believe Americans should understand. It's not that our form of government, as it was set up by the founders, is wrong. That we should be looking instead for some sort of a socialism. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that America, by and large, is not living up to the concepts of the Constitution, of what our nation was intended to be, and instead it has become sort of out of control, empowered by elites, basically in the West predominantly, and is attempting to enforce a world that's not so much safe from democracy or safe for democracy, but it's really safe for the bankers, the international bankers, and those the wealthy that would like to continue to be wealthy and dominate corporations, dominate international banks, and have been running the show for the better part of the last 100 years, and indirectly less so for at least 200 years. So if that's a lot to say, but that, to answer your question, those are some of the key things that Americans should know.
Uh-huh. Well, let's go into what you see coming on the forefront, and also with the prophecy of the last popes, the rise of the Antichrist, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. Well, the prophecy of the popes, a friend of mine, Chris Putnam, and another friend, Tom Horn, wrote Petros Hermanos, and they have a specific view that the prophecy of St. Malachi, who was an Irish priest and essentially a bishop in Ireland, that when he went to Rome, and I believe it was in the 13th, perhaps in the 12th century, that he had a vision, and of course he saw, I think it was something like, I forget how many, it was like 200 popes from that point forward to a final pope who would be called Peter the Roman, and it was this last pope that would be the pope when Jesus Christ came back, and the church would be, the Catholic Church would be apostate at that time, and Rome would even be, according to some, would be destroyed. So the view is that Pope John Paul I, Pope John Paul II, Benedict XVI, that all of these popes fit, as do, one can go back and look at Pope Paul and Pope John, and kind of go all the way back and look at these little verses, usually 2 to 4 lines of a verse, that were the prophecy of St. Malachi, and that these tend to map without too much imagination to the identity of each of the popes. And again, according to the prophecy of St. Malachi, the current pope, Francis I, would be the last pope, and it would be during his time that Jesus Christ would return. And of course, that's speculative, and it's really intriguing. Putnam and Horn had actually accurately identified that Benedict XVI was going to resign. He was going to be the first pope in hundreds of years to actually resign the office, and they in fact were right within just a few months of their prediction. And the fact that Francis I has been elected the pope, that he is a Jesuit, and that the Jesuits have been sort of the intellectual arm, and many Catholics would say have been sort of the sort of the black sheep of the Roman priesthood, the monastic order and so forth, for some time. They've been in place for several hundred years, but a lot of Catholics are not in favor of the meaning of the Jesuits and what they have done, and so there's a lot of skepticism regarding what it is that ultimately is Francis I's agenda. Having said that, there's a lot of popular outpouring of love and affection for this pope, and but it is intriguing to wonder: is this pope in fact the last pope before Christ comes? Is the prophecy of Saint Malachi in fact a prophecy that should be believed in? It certainly is not a biblical prophecy, but it is a prophecy that seems to show evidence that there's something to it. I personally have taken the view in the book I wrote, Decoding Doomsday, where I speculate, based upon the publishing of the prophecy in 1595, that it's very likely that the prophecy was actually written by Nostradamus, who died in 1567, and he was very fascinated by the papacy, and he was very interested. May in fact have done a watercolor book that where he lays out different pictures of the different popes and so forth, and so it's very conceivable that it was Nostradamus that actually used Saint Malachi as a pseudonym, more or less, and put his words in the Saint Malachi, who had died 400 years before him or 300 years before him, and so that's my personal speculation, is that it may have been Nostradamus, but I would just say that it bears close scrutiny, because whether it was Nostradamus or it was St. Malachi, the pattern, and one can go to Wikipedia, by the way, and look this up, look up St. Malachi's prophecy or the prophecy of the popes, and you can kind of look at the mapping of each of the popes to these little couplets or verses in the St. Malachi prophecy. And for those really interested, then I'd say, well, you need to get a copy of Petros Romanos. So, so it's definitely an intriguing prophecy and bears watching.
Right. So how do you see, like, what are you looking for? And do you believe that Francis is the false prophet, and that, he'll be introducing the Antichrist at some point? And what are the signs, the harbingers that you're looking for, as we are recognizing the season?
Right. Well, I'd say that I'm not a Catholic, obviously, and I am not in favor of the concept of the papal hierarchical structure at all. There's aspects of the Catholic Church that are admirable, but theologically it's very different than Reformation theology and evangelical theology, and I sort of class myself in that regard. Theologically, I'm very much more akin and in the same camp as Martin Luther or John Calvin than I am Francis I or Saint Benedict or any of the Catholics, right? So I'm very skeptical about that. I think it's conceivable. I don't know that there's any real evidence or proof yet, other than the concern I have. That's probably the most relevant concern is the issue of unification. There's a lot of talk about unity and a willingness to sacrifice truth in order to bring unity. The movement of the charismatic leadership to find unity with the Catholic Church, that's an ongoing issue, and that really concerns me.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back for final segment. All right, welcome back for final segment. I want to read this paragraph for you, Douglas, and then we'll go back into commentary on your last book and the focus on Mars. This is just a Q&A with David Icke, which I certainly don't endorse him as a, but he does have a lot of intriguing revelations, but I do believe that he's part of a establishment. But anyways, he asks Arizona Wilder, in your experience being brought up in this Illuminati environment, were you ever told anything about where these reptilians came from and what is the history of it all? And she says, I was made to learn through Mothers of Darkness, which is a certain aspect of the organization, because it was an early part of my training, the history of what was the Illuminati on this planet. And what I learned was that the Aryans were originally from Mars, and the Reptilians came to that planet. They came from another place. They came to that planet to rule. They wanted to mix, and so they said with that race, but they became the overlords. And the Martians or Aryans were seeking to escape from it. They went to the moon, and then they were attacked, and then they went to the earth and established culture here on earth approximately 6,000 years ago. And at that point in time, they were doing well, and they were mixing with the indigenous population of this earth. They were getting along, and then about 4,000 years ago, the Reptilians arrived here and again began to take over. And they installed themselves in various places underground in the earth, and also this one part of them, the ruling part, took over and became involved in the politics and in the religion and started controlling through these means, infiltrating into that and becoming that, and blood rituals started happening. And since that time, that is the way it has been. And so I wanted to get you to comment on, well, not only this, this particular passage, but also the Genesis 3, the Nakash, and the Revelation 12, the assertion that Satan, Lucifer, Satan the adversary, that he is this dragon-like entity, a winged snake or a feathered serpent.
Right. Well, lots there. Certainly in the quotation that you just read, there are a lot of things that I would call speculation. Some things that I think coincides with David Flynn's point of view that he talks about, and that I reflect in my book, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, that we've been talking about some tonight, and so there's some aspects of that. The general theory is that this coincides or could coincide with what the Bible talks about in terms of in Genesis chapter 6:4, where the sons of God came into the daughters of men and created a race known as the Nephilim, and which really meant the fallen ones. And that the Nephilim were also known, Moses, who I happen to believe wrote the book of Genesis, comments that these were the men of renown. And by that, even someone as sort of conservative and intellectual as Francis Schaeffer suggests that this is a reference to the Titans, the Olympians, to the mythologies of the world, and it may be the Nephilim were in fact sort of the actual I'd say entities or humanoids, but they were a hybrid race, and it was from that our mythologies, our traditional mythologies of Zeus and so forth, that they were derived from. So Flynn goes into the mystery religions of the Greeks and talks in more detail about the mystery religions of Canaan, really beginning with Babylon and Sumer, really moving to Canaan, the Canaanites. The Book of Enoch, which is one of the questions I don't think I quite answered earlier, was about the pseudographical works, the apocryphal works, and the Book of Enoch has been the one that's probably created the most controversy in the last 5-6 years, which is a story that there were 200 watchers that came down on Mount Hermon. And in effect, the Book of Enoch was giving sort of an expanded amount of detail on what Genesis 6:4 references regarding the sons of God, which is a veiled reference to angels, to angelic beings. And the idea David Flynn talks about is it possible that Mars, or a planet specifically that no longer exists, that is that was blown up in perhaps 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, or perhaps even longer, but that the intelligent beings that existed there, that they did move to Earth, and that they corrupted the Earth. There's there's some reason to believe that. A couple of very obscure references in the Bible to Rahab. A friend of mine has written a book called The Rahab Conspiracy, which talks about this. This gets into the notion of a pre-Adamite race of beings that existed on Earth, and whether those pre-Adamite intelligences were in fact the hybrid race. So there's a lot of different speculation on these things, and I find it really interesting, and I talk about it a good amount. There was a scientist named Tom Flanders who's deceased a few years ago, but he was the head of the Naval Observatory, and he talked about the so-called exploding planet hypothesis. And it goes back even to Kepler, I think, several hundred years ago, essentially saying that where the asteroid belt is where there should be a planet approximately the size of Saturn that would have existed between Mars and Jupiter, and it was this planet that exploded. And Hoagland talks about the exploding planet hypothesis, and the hypothesis is that Mars is actually a moon of this planet, and that when one studies the topographical, sort of geographical features of the Martian surface, you'll see that one half of the surface is heavily cratered, and the other half is not. And so, Mars does rotate, and so the question is, well, how could one half of the surface be so cratered and the other half not? Well, the answer would be, that those craters were formed in a very short window of time, perhaps within a few hours, as opposed to like our moon, which has been cratered through, not just millennia, but potentially millions of years, depending upon how old one believes the world is. And so there's evidence that Mars is more of a moon that lost its mother planet and got spun out into its own orbit. And Phobos and Deimos, its two moons, they're not really symmetrical moons. They're sort of big rocks, and they may have just been in effect asteroids that were captured by the gravitational pull of Mars. And so you've got some really interesting physical evidence to speculate on that. You get into Joseph P. Farah, who is a kind of a quasi-secular author, has taught even at Oral Roberts University, but he was not by no means a biblical literalist, probably not even an Orthodox Christian in most any sense. But he talks favorably of Thomas Flanders and talks about the exploding planet hypothesis. He talks about the possibility of a cosmic war, and points to the scarring of Mars, this great big scar across the face of Mars known as Valles Marineris, the Mariner Valley, because it was discovered by the Mariner space probe back in the 1960s. And but he speculates that there is a cosmic, or has been a cosmic war. And he has written a number of books, a book specifically called A Cosmic War, and talks about the evidence from looking at the text of ancient religions that, in fact, there's good evidence there that there was a cosmic war, perhaps 1,000,000 years ago, perhaps 10,000 years ago. It's not exactly clear when, but he argues that there was one, and that this would explain what we observe, characteristic of the topology on the surface of Mars. And so it really makes for some interesting reading, and I have done presentation on the subject of, was there a pre-Adamite Earth? Was there a race of intelligent beings on Earth prior to Adam and Eve? Believing, as I do, that I believe the world is old. It may be 4.5 billion years old, but that the human race was a race created by God, the biblical God, and that occurred roughly 6,000 years ago. It might have been 10,000 years ago, but it's thousands of years, not millions of years. And so the question is, trying to reconcile the biblical account with this notion of a race that existed on Mars. And then back to the point of the reptilians, I was just listening earlier today to a recent program that Chris Putnam and Tom Horn were on with Steve Quayle on Hagman and Hagman, talking about Chris and Tom's new book, On the Path of the Immortals. And they were talking about in effect, the essence of the seraphim versus the cherubim. The seraphim were the sort of the blazing, fiery serpents, and would probably give rise to the concept of dragons in ancient cultures, certainly in China, but not just in China. You see it in Europe. It's again the red dragon is on the heraldry of the King of England, and so there's of course these great myths of red dragons. And is that a reference to the seraphim? Chris argues that it is, that the King James Version originally, in its version, it translates the seraphim as the fiery dragons. And so, Chris argues that the reptilians are in fact a race of perhaps derived from the seraphim. Gary Stearman talks about this. Gary's I consider a scholar, and talks about the notion that we look at Ezekiel 28, we talk about the nature of what the Bible expresses regarding Satan, Lucifer as well, although the question about Lucifer and whether that's a proper name for Satan is another question. But anyway, that Lucifer, that Satan was a reptilian, and that perhaps as a cherubim, he was the master of a reptilian kingdom, and it was perhaps a reptilian kingdom, which we know as the dinosaurs, that existed, and that was the pre-Adamic race. So there's just all kinds of interesting theories about this, and it's not likely that this side of the parousia, the coming of Christ, that we're likely to know the answer to these things, but they're fun to talk about and intriguing. And I think you used the term the Nakish, which is if you have studied this a bit more than I, Zen, but I think that we're talking really about the snake or the Nakish that was in the garden, if I'm not mistaken.
Uh-huh.
Right. So anyway, so those are some of the issues associated with Mars, the exploding planet, the possibility of it being the home of an ancient race, and that race may have migrated to Earth when its home planet was destroyed. And even the face on Mars appears to resemble a cherubim, if you have an inclination to see it that way. And perhaps it was a monument to Lucifer, perhaps.
Yeah, well, there seems to definitely be something to that area there on Mars, and I absolutely believe that there were previous civilizations and large megalithic structures, even with what we find as far as the connections to Glastonbury and Silverberry Hill and the Tholis, and so yeah. Which brings me to another passage I wanted to share and then get your commentary on this from Jeremiah, because it's my opinion that this particular passage is also speaking about the destruction of, the possibly a fallen angelic civilization, could even be that of Mars, or the Rahab or Tiamat, or whatever you want to call it, but where it says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heaven were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord, and by his fierce anger. And so there's speculation that this is also connected to the destruction, if in fact, because the Sumerian teachings talk about, and even the Enuma Elish speak about that the planet that was where the asteroid belt is now was once the Earth, and that it was called Tiamat or Rahab, and that being gutted by one of the moons of Nibiru, that it swapped orbits, or however that happened with Mars, and the atmosphere was destroyed on Mars, and that's the Genesis 1:1, 1:2, how the earth became null and void, and that this was a judgment against the fallen angels for, whatever they had done previously. And so there seems to be something to it, and definitely that, the asteroid belt is a result of some great cataclysm sometime in our ancient past, and even the rings surrounding Saturn, the dust that creates the rings of not only Saturn, but there are rings of other planets, that this is the debris field from that ancient cataclysm so long ago. And so, your comment on that?
Right. Yeah, I think that the notion of Thomas J. Flanders and the exploding planet hypothesis is that there could have been a number of mechanisms, sort of astrophysically, that could have been responsible. As I commented earlier, Joseph P. Farrell speculates that there was a cosmic war, that perhaps even the pyramids of Giza may have been designed to be some sort of cosmic weapon system, and that there could have been that kind of war. It's of course, great speculation that scientists really would not necessarily all align on. It's interesting that Carl Sagan, back in the early 60s, co-wrote a book with a Russian scientist, and he talks about the fact that he believes there is something peculiar about Mars, that I believe it's Phobos, that the moon Phobos is hollow, and it's even possible that our moon is hollow, although there's an alternative theory about why it is that our moon rings when it's struck, such as it was with one of the Apollo spacecraft. And so Phobos, if it's truly hollow, and Sagan says that it is, that it says that it must be artificial, that there is not a natural way for Phobos to be hollow. And, interesting that, let's see, who was the Neil Armstrong? Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin was number 2. Buzz Aldrin talks about the monolith on Phobos, and talks about the fact that it's hollow, and drops some hints that he speculates that there's something very weird and peculiar and even artificial about aspects of Mars. So, do I necessarily believe that Earth and Mars switch places? Not necessarily. I think there could be other, as I said, sort of geophysical, astrophysical explanations for what might have happened, but I'm not a scientist. Just from the reading and the research I've done, that you don't have to go to that kind of explanation to posit the possibility that there were intelligences on Mars at some time, that there seems to be not completely compelling, but somewhat compelling photographic evidence, from at least from my vantage point, that there look like there are artifacts. I've got in one of my presentations some photographs that really cause you to scratch your head to say, wow, how could that have been a natural structure on the planet Mars? And so the planet, the asteroid belt, all that sort of says something happened. And yes, it does tie into the notion of what's known as the gap theory, Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:2, that there was a chaos. The verse you read earlier was from Jeremiah 4, chapter 4, verses 23 through 26. And in Hebrew, the language is tohu vabohu, without form and void. And the way that it probably is more appropriately translated is that the earth became without form or void. Right. And so, yeah, I as I said, I believe and have even debated that the earth is old, but that something cataclysmic happened. The earth was inundated with water, and the speculation is that this great planet was on its surface inundated with water, covered with water, that it appears that Mars was, when this planet blew up, that Mars was smashed with a great water bath.
Right.
Mars was at one time covered with an ocean that was perhaps something like 4, 5, 6 feet deep, and but Mars was such a light amount of gravity that it literally couldn't hold its water, and so the water eventually evaporated, dissipated, and most of the water, basically left Mars. Mars still has some snowfall, we've discovered, still has some some moisture in the atmosphere, but not necessarily enough to sustain life as we know it. So there's a lot of interesting things, and I do believe that there are 2 floods talked about in the Bible. I believe that the Noahic flood was the second flood. The first flood. Yes.
I just wanted to let you know we've got 2 minutes remaining, and I wanted to give you a chance to give out your website and your contact information and everything again, and then final commentary.
Yeah. Again, my website is faith-happens.com. You can find me, do a search on dougwoodward.com. You can find me on Amazon, S as in Stephen, S Douglas Woodward, and all of my books. You can find this book we've talked about, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, which I think if you're interested in these topics, you'll enjoy the book. It covers these and many other topics that we haven't even talked about. And so I'd encourage your listeners to take a look at that. The books are available in Kindle as well as printed. And let's see, in terms of last comments, just to finish up the last point, it really gets into the question of creationism and an alternative point of view other than a young Earth, and it's a point of view that I hold. And it sounds like you might as well, Zen.
Yes, I do, absolutely. Hey, I want to thank you, Douglas, for making yourself available, and if you would, join us again at some other future date.
Well, I'd be pleased to. Thank you so much.
All right. God bless all. Night.
Good night.